Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the pre-show talk for the Chalk Garden on this most unbelievable and beautiful set. Blimey, Alan. You all know I'm Kate Mosse. I'm a novelist and a playwright and the biographer of CFT, and it is my enormous pleasure to be allowed to be let loose on the creative people who create the wonderful festival put together by Daniel Evans and Rachel Tackley. And welcome back to the brilliant and wonderful Alan Strachan.
It's lovely to be here. I like this theatre. I also like the Minerva. It's a delight to be back.
Now, you're probably going to tell me off for being gushy straight away before we start, but many of you will know that the previous directors of the theatre, Jonathan Church and Alan Finch, always said that you and indeed Penelope Keith agreeing to do Entertaining Angels in 2006 in their minds was one of the things that helped them save the theatre. Well, so I think that deserves a round of applause, if nothing else.
It was a difficult time. I've run a theatre. I know how difficult it is. The financial situation, I had no idea until after the event.
That was sneaky programming by then, wasn't it?
How desperate it was. It was teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. So I had no idea. If I'd known that, the pressure on the show would have been awful. We would have probably had an awful time doing it. But because there was no pressure, Entertaining Angels, which was a new play, turned out to be great fun. And it did remarkably well at the box office. And then they got quite a lot of income subsequently when it went on tour for a very long time. And I just remember the one incident on that was on the very first performance. I'd gone to have a pre-show calming drink at the Bell.
Yes.
And I was coming back, and everyone was running around, and I thought, oh God, what's happened? Crisis. And Jonathan was running, and Alan was running. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, we can't find the house full boards. The show's sold out, but they haven't been used for 3 years, so nobody knows where they are. So that got it off to quite a good start. They did find them,
They did find them in the end, and they needed them for the whole run, in fact.
More or less, but they were very dusty, but they gave them a polish. That was fun. And then Penny and I later came back to the Minerva, which was also very enjoyable, with a solo play, which she'd never done. Not the easiest of things to do, an hour and 3/4. Mrs. Pat, which is about the redoubtable Mrs. Patrick Campbell. And that was a completely different kind of challenge, to fill a stage for an hour, not 2 hours, counting the interval. And that was huge fun as well. And this one has, although much more of a challenge, has also, so far, been very enjoyable.
Well, we're thrilled to have, the dream team, as it were, you and Penelope Keith, and some wonderful people, obviously Amanda Root and lots of other people who know the stage. So one of the things that our wonderful audiences always like to know is how a particular play gets chosen and gets put into the repertory. So did Daniel approach you? Did you want to do this?
No, it was the other way around. It was the other way around on this one. I wrote to Penny about something. I've completely forgotten what. It was about maybe 18 months ago. And she wrote back, and I think we ended up both saying, well, we must do something else. And then I suggested the Chalk Garden to her, not knowing whether she'd ever seen the play or whether she knew it. It turned out both were the case. And I said, well, should we approach a commercial producer? And she said, it was Penny who said, I think Chichester would be ideal, which I agreed with. So I rang Daniel, and by complete synchronicity, it turned out that he had the play in mind.
Did he?
Yes, for this year.
Right.
But there was a big but at that point, because the play was optioned. Somebody had bought an option and paid quite a large sum of money in order to have the exclusive rights to produce it on Broadway, with another dame. It was going to be Dame Angela Lansbury playing Mrs. St. Maurne, the matriarch at the centre of the play. Yeah. And he held on to the rights for quite a long time. It was announced, I think they even started casting some of the other parts, and it was all set to go. And then Angela Lansbury, this is my understanding of it, and I think it's the authentic version, she had a change of heart. she was told she'd have to do 8 performances a week in order to make it financially viable, even at Broadway prices.
And it's a huge role, isn't it?
It's a very challenging role, very vocally demanding, physically quite demanding, emotionally quite demanding. And I think in the end, having talked to her family, she thought, I'm just not really wise to take on this task. So she said no, at which point the rights became available, at which point Daniel, like a greyhound, leapt out of the slips and was able to buy the rights. It had to be approved by Enid Bagnold's, surprisingly, still alive youngest son, called Dominic Jones.
Well, she only died in 1981.
1980s, no, but later than that. I think it was about... Yeah. No, I think you're right. It was early 80s. But she was 90.
Yes.
She had been born in late 1880s, I think. Remarkable woman. And I think the family have always been very careful to look after her estate as well as they possibly could. So they wanted to be sure that, A, the play would be well cast, and I think once they realised it was Chichester, they realised that that was probably likely to be the case. And so he got the rights. Yeah. But at one point it seemed as if we weren't going to be able to do it.
No, so which is, such a shame when there was the sense of this great chemistry and let's do this play.
Well, yes, but of course Broadway producers are very ferocious animals, and they were thinking of the money. I think they were thinking they would make a huge amount of money on Broadway with Angela Lansbury, which they would have done. I mean, she's a remarkably fine actress, and maybe they thought they might bring it to London as well. I don't know.
Well, I think we definitely are the beneficiaries of this. So, I mean, Enid Bagnold is, in many ways, is probably best known for her famous novel, National Velvet.
Yes, I suppose that is the best known.
In terms of that sort of thing. But the Chalk Garden is inspired by her house in Rottingdean. And
oh, certainly, yes.
So tell us a little bit about the play.
She had written plays. None had achieved anything like major success. 1 or 2 had been downright flops. And she had a play done on Broadway in 1951, I think it was, called Gertie. Not a very good title. No. Gertie was about a very ambitious young woman who was ambitious really only for fame. She wanted fame. She was hungry to be a celebrity and be successful, which Enid Bagnold was. Yes. She was desperately keen to be recognised from a very early age. She just wanted to be somebody special. When Gertie failed, she was really in a very low state indeed. And she came back to Rottingdean, to this extraordinary house, which was the weekend house, basically, for her and her husband, who was head of Reuters, Sir Roderick Jones. And
yes, because she was Lady Jones.
She was Lady. She didn't like the title. Well, she liked the title Lady, but she didn't like the name Jones. She felt that was a bit down market. She was sitting at home brooding. She wasn't very happy. She had 4 children. She loved all the business to do with children and the relationships between, as you'll see in the play, the whole thing about nurturing children and rearing children really mattered to her. She felt that was a kind of immortality. Anyway, she had to find a companion stroke governess for her youngest grandchild, who was called Pandora. And she placed an advertisement, I presume, in the Brighton and Hove Argus, or something like that, and got a lot of replies. And she was fascinated by one particular applicant who was described as an aquiline woman, rather like an eagle, and didn't talk very much. But Bagnold didn't ask for any references and took this woman on. And the most remarkable thing about this woman was that she hardly spoke. So I don't know what instructions she was giving the granddaughter, probably very little. But anyway, she stayed. And then one day, a great friend of the Joneses, I mean, they mixed in very high circles, judges, politicians, everybody. A judge called Justice Henry Cassels, I think that was his name, he came to lunch at Rottingdean. And the governess was having lunch with the granddaughter, and Bagnold noticed that the woman was almost hypnotically fascinated by the judge, who was talking about current cases at the Old Bailey, I think including a murder case. And she was clearly absolutely fascinated. And that gave her the seed for the play. It was transformed completely. I mean, you know as well, you probably take some incidents from reality into your novels, but they get changed, they get transformed, they get...
It's the spark, it's
exactly,
not the,
it's a seed,
but
the growth is entirely yours. And that was very much the case with this play, and there is an applicant for a job as a governor's companion, there is a judge who comes to lunch. I'm not going to say any more, because it will spoil it. And that was what gave her the idea for the play. And it had, like all her plays have, a great deal of her rather special dialogue. She loved words. Okay. I always think she must have been like a master jeweller, spreading her diamonds out on a black piece of cloth and then selecting them and seeing how one matched with the other. She loved the sound of words, the shapes they made. And she called them her plums. She liked the plums of her speeches, and indeed she used to hang her plums on a washing line across her writing room, and when she lost inspiration, she would just reach for a plum and stick it in.
Really?
Yes, which wasn't a good idea.
I don't know, I'm quite liking that.
No, I wouldn't recommend it, because what happened quite often was that the play became clotted. You know, there was just too much, there was too many words, and her speeches got rather bloated. And when she sent the play to her agent, it was rejected by London producers. And it was her agent who this is why it was first done in America.
I wondered why it was first
Oddly
done
enough,
on Broadway,
it was first done on Broadway in 1956. She wrote it in 1955 on Broadway. She wrote it in 1954. Anyway, by various happenstances, it came into the hands of a rather remarkable woman, as formidable as Enid Bagnold. I mean, it was a wonderful match in many ways, because they struck real sparks off each other. And this was a woman called Irene Mayer Selznick. She was the daughter of one mogul, Louis B. Mayer, Hollywood, and an ex-wife of another, David O. Selznick. And when she divorced Selznick, she was a woman of great energy, enormous appetite for doing things. And she went to New York. She wanted to get away from the world of Hollywood and carve out a career for herself. And she became a Broadway producer and struck what they call pay dirt with her very first production, which was a little number called A Streetcar Named Desire. So she was riding high. And I think maybe she did a play called Bell, Book and Candle, which was also quite successful. So she was really doing well. And in a very short space of time, she'd established herself as a really leading Broadway producer, to a lot of resentment from the old guard, who resented A, that she'd been so successful so quickly, and B, that she was a woman, because hardly any female producers, either in the West End or on Broadway in those days. And she offended people too by her brusqueness. She was no respecter of persons, but then neither was Enid Bagnold. Anyway, they met, and for some reason, something in the play might have been the mother-daughter relationship, because Selznick, Irene Selznick, had a fraught relationship, shall we say, with her own mother. But she really did respond to the play and said, I'm coming over to England to work on it with you. Now, she didn't write a line of the play. She was the first to say, I wrote none of it. But what she did do was bully, cajole, persuade, coax, all the adjectives, all the verbs you want to use to shape the play, because it was a bit formless, I gather. The original version doesn't exist, sadly, so I have no idea exactly what her criticisms were, but basically they were to trim it of its excess verbiage and make the plot more...
Sort of taut.
Well, just make it, yes, exactly, tighter and frankly a little bit more believable. And she worked for, I think, nearly 18 months. She would fly over regularly from New York, where she lived in great luxury in the Pier Hotel, and come to the falling down house in Rottingdean, where pictures would fall off the walls in the middle of the night, and you had to go 100 yards to the loo. Not the luxury she was used to. And they worked on the play. She would come down from the Dorchester, which is where she stayed in London, to Rottingdean on a Friday afternoon and go back on the Brighton Bell on a Monday morning. And they worked and worked and worked over those weekends. And gradually the play took shape. And then it developed into a real saga of...
I like the fact that none of this counts as a saga. It's about to be a saga.
The original production, it was like Murphy's Law. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. First of all, they couldn't cast it. Nobody wanted to be in it.
And why is that? Given
they were frightened.
This
They were frightened of it, I think. It's well, you'll see. It's a play that's like no other. I can't compare it to anything. Some people say it's very Chekhovian, which it sort of is. Some people say it's a bit like Wilde. Some of the language sort of is, but none of these comparisons really makes any sense. It's its own being.
It's what it is. I mean, it is very unusual play.
It's very unusual.
It's kind of perfect,
Absolutely.
but itself,
But it's what it is, and people were confused by it and wondered whether it was meant to be funny, some of it, or whether it was just a slight work of a slightly deranged woman. Nobody could quite work it out because it was sort of new. There hadn't been anything like it.
And it was all of those, it was sort of the time of Rattigan and all of those sorts of writers at the time, wasn't it? So that people were, that was what they were.
Although, ironically, in this country, it was produced 3 weeks before Look Back in Anger. So
was it?
things were on the cusp of change.
Yes.
Anyway, in New York, everything went wrong. Eventually, Gladys Cooper was coaxed into playing Mrs. St. Maur, the part that Penelope Keith is now playing. Bagnold had desperately wanted Edith Evans, but she turned it down. So they ended up with Gladys Cooper, who was still very conscious. I think she must have been touching 70 then. The character is meant to be in her 70s. And she was very conscious that she had been possibly one of the great beauties of the 20s and 30s. And she didn't like some of the references to age in the play. I'm not going to tell you what the line is, but Mrs. St. Maur's first line, she took huge exception to and said, I can't say this, it's not, my public won't accept it. Enid Bagnold, who didn't give a toss about Gladys Cooper's public, just wanted her lines to be heard. They fought like cat and dog, and on the first night in New York, Gladys Cooper just left them out. She just cut them.
Did she?
Well,
she just started the play where she wanted?
She started the play 4 lines later. No. So there was nothing that anybody could do. No. Too late. And then the director of the first production was a remarkable man, who some of you I'm sure have heard of. He was called George Cukor, famous film director, who had been sacked by David O. Selznick from Gone with the Wind after only 2 weeks. But he directed some extraordinary movies, David Copperfield and Anna Karenina and Camille with Garbo, all those films. Anyway, he hadn't directed a play for a very long time and was very rusty. And he'd also just come off a movie. He hadn't prepared terribly well. And Irene Selznick then followed her husband by sacking him. He had about 3 weeks of rehearsal and he was got rid of. And they had terrible trouble finding somebody else because if a play loses its director, everyone thinks something's wrong with the play. They're usually right. But they did find another director and he took over and things were a bit better. And then everybody started quarrelling with Cecil Beaton, who designed it.
I mean, he did set and costumes, didn't he?
He did set and costumes. I gather, obviously didn't see it, but the costumes, I gather, were all right. But the set, and I've seen a lot of pictures of it, the set looked like something out of House and Garden for a house on Long Island in the 1950s. Everything was white, bone white, absolutely virgin white, with a lot of beautiful rattan furniture. I mean, it really looked, and this is meant to be a house that's been lived in for 40 years.
Yes,
and just
in Sussex.
In Rottingdean. So the set was disastrous. It looked like maybe a Noel Coward play was about to take place in it. But somehow, despite all the and people were walking out, shouting at each other, just like most plays, really. But they really did have an awful lot of arguments. But it opened successfully. The New York critics decided that this was a very special play. And as soon as that all happened, immediately the leading London producer of the time, Hugh Beaumont, immediately said, yes, I want it, having turned it down originally. And then she did get what she wanted. Bagnold, that is, which was Edith Evans, did play Mrs. St. Maur. Not a bad cast. Peggy Ashcroft played the applicant for the governess's part, and Felix Elmer played the judge. So it was a pretty good cast, and it was very, very successful. I didn't see that one either. But it's had a few revivals subsequently, but not many.
Did she, Enid Bagnold, did she keep diaries or are there biographies? I mean, do you know what she felt about this?
Well, she didn't like the first production. She really hated it because it was too busy.
So the fact it was successful wasn't enough
no, she
for her.
was delighted it was successful because she made a great deal of money out of it, and she liked the shekels, did Dame Enid. Well, she wasn't a dame. I must keep forgetting to call her a dame. She was rather cross that she wasn't. Anyway, but she didn't like the fact that people moved on the stage. Ideally, Enid Bagnold would have liked her plays to be staged with people sitting like us in a row saying her beautiful lines with a set of screens behind them.
Nothing to detract from her glory.
Exactly. Everything should be keyed on the word. And she's right. Words are very important, but you can't do it as if it's a recital. And in fact, there's a story about a director of a later play that Margaret Leighton was in, and she was in the stalls screaming, "They're moving too much, they're moving too much, stop them moving, stop them moving." And the director, who wasn't George Cukor, stopped and said, "Look, Enid," I think it was Miss Bagnold after that.
Yes.
"Look, Enid, this is not a recital." And she snapped back, "No, but it's not a skating rink either." she just wanted the focus to be on her plums, I'm afraid. She was marginally happier with the London production because she had the actress of her dreams, which was Dame Edith Evans, although they fell out violently on a later play. But she was happy with her performance in the Chalk Garden, and I think, I don't know, it's not recorded anywhere, but I would be very, very surprised if she hadn't been happy with Dame Peggy Ashcroft's work. And it was, as I say, it was directed by John Gielgud, who coped very well with her, although he did occasionally have to stand outside Edith Evans's dressing room, barring the way to stop her getting in to give her notes. Because it was, as I say, she was no respecter of persons. If she felt an actor was misreading one of her lines, she would just barge up and tell them. And of course,
nobody wants a living writer doing that.
Well, some behave themselves, but she just didn't care. The words were what mattered. She wasn't interested in the visual side, although she didn't like what Cecil Beaton did on Broadway. And in London, she took a violent exception to the West End design. Beaton wasn't used because he'd been such trouble in the States. But in London, she didn't like the set either. She thought it was, I think she said it was common. It was very common. Biggest insult she could possibly make. Exactly. I don't think she would say this was common.
No, I mean, and this, of course, is the wonderful Simon Higlett, who is such a friend to Chichester and has done so many wonderful things here.
And I've worked with him too, and he understands this space. I mean, you probably won't notice, maybe you have, but this is a first in a way for Chichester, which is the actual real stage, the hexagon.
Yes.
That isn't here. That's gone for this play.
Yep.
So we are lower than we normally are. And we both felt very strongly that it just brings the play.
Because of the intimacy of it.
Yeah, more into what we call in Scotland the body of the kirk. It just gets it more shared. And I think that happens with most plays here. I mean, one of the reasons I like an open stage or theatre in the round, which I've also done a lot of, is the fact that the audience and the actors are sort of in the same space. They're in the same room, so they're breathing the same air. And I just find the intimacy of that. This is a big house, it does seat over 1,000. But I always feel that if the set design is good enough, and although a lot of designers try and pretend this is really a proscenium stage. It isn't, and there's no point in trying to make it into a proscenium stage. Whenever a designer does that, I always feel it never really works. The stage just doesn't have its right dynamic. But I feel if the set is right, and if the acting has the right kind of focus and intention, then it doesn't seem a big theatre.
But also, I felt when I was watching some of your technical rehearsal, it really did feel like a house in Sussex of that period, that there are doors in different places and people come in from the...
And funny little nooks,
Yes, exactly. And it was rather wonderful because often you would understand that we were being brought in to kind of snoop sometimes and make our own judgments about those looks that were going between the characters.
Yes. I mean, the basic instruction, when Simon and I first met, when we knew we'd be doing the play, one always has these rather vague initial ideas. I mean, we don't talk about colour of the set or furniture, not at a first meeting. And I think the basic brief, if you like to call it that, to him was, there are 9 characters in the play, but I would rather like it if there could be 10. The 10th character being the room.
Yes.
And I think he's done that. I really do think he has.
It's one of those when you come in...
He went to Rottingdean.
Did he get to actually see? Because was it Burne-Jones's house?
It was originally Burne-Jones's house, and then after Burne-Jones, it was inhabited by another artist who was William Nicholson.
Of course.
He lived there for quite a long time as well. And I've seen the house, but I didn't go with Simon. I couldn't. I was back in Scotland. But the current owner couldn't have been more helpful and showed him round, and he was able to wander all over it. And the garden he was allowed into as well. He found that very helpful. And he took lots and lots of photographs. It couldn't obviously be the same as it was in her day. It's currently, by the way, if you've got a spare 3.95 million, you can buy it. It's for sale.
Absolutely. Great.
So you'll be down there tomorrow.
Yes, I will. By 2.
It's a remarkable place, but of course, over the years, it's changed, and now it's like something out of the Farrow and Ball catalogue.
Yes,
everything is perfect, which it certainly wasn't in Enid Bagnald's day.
I mean, this is such a beautiful set, and obviously you will see it looking down, but just being on it. So when you are putting... you start rehearsing. I know you're rehearsing in London. You have obviously wonderful company that you put together, not least of all the great, very, very popular in Chichester, of course, Penny Keith. When do you start introducing all of these additional props and bits and pieces? Because there's a lot here.
Yes.
And when does that come into the rehearsal process?
Quite late. We were sort of lucky because Chichester has such an extensive furniture store and props store. Even in the London rehearsal room, which luckily was quite big, it was the RSC rehearsal room in Clapham, which is big, so you can keep stuff at one end of the room. We had, most of it's been recovered, but we had things like, we had this with a different cover, we had that chaise, and we had that one.
Yes. Because the way people get up and down is quite specific in that period
we
of
had
time.
to lose them at points because they needed work, and we had to lower the back of that chaise, for instance, otherwise the side seats would be rather ill-served. And props, we didn't have the real props, but we had things that could easily stand in for them. But then when we came down to Chichester, because we rehearsed for 2 weeks in the Stephen Pimlott room across the way, gradually we got more and more of the real props, which was a help for this play. Even things like a bulb catalogue or a plant catalogue of the period was much more helpful than looking at an old copy of Woman's Own. You know, you can sort of imagine that world.
Bed jackets and things. With the when you ever read, and there's a wonderful article by the biographer and writer Anne Sebber in the programme. For those of you who like a programme, it's a wonderful article about her. A lot of the interpretation about this play always talk about it as being one of the great plays about mother-daughter relationships. Do you think that is why it is seen as this really distinct piece of work, or do you think, how would you define it, actually?
I think it's a play about dysfunctional families, which an awful lot of the best plays are. I mean, the late Tyrone Guthrie was a great, great director, had a theory that all the best plays, from Oedipus through to Look Back in Anger, were fundamentally family plays. There was a family relationship somewhere. And if you think of Chekhov, Shakespeare, there's a kernel of truth there. And I think this play, even if your family isn't from a household that has a huge house in London and also a huge house in Rottingdean, very few people have both, very few people had both even then, it doesn't matter. You can still relate to the psychological problems of a family. This includes a lot of... I think what came over in the play, the more we rehearsed it, was that an awful lot of people in it are damaged in some way. And damaged people tend to respond to each other. They tend to recognise something in each other's psyche that may be a bit flawed. And I think that's true of this play. There's a lovely part, which is probably only someone like Enid Bagnold who would have written it, of a manservant. And I'm not going to tell you that he had I am going to tell you that he had a previous life, but I'm not going to tell you what it was, because it comes out in the play. And he's in a curious position of being a dependent but also fiercely independent. He has his own passionate beliefs, but he's absolutely dependent on the woman who has taken him in, literally. And that character, who's called Maitland, is very, very kind to the granddaughter, who's sort of the fulcrum of the play. The actual plot revolves round the granddaughter. And I think that's full of a rather compassionate sort of insight. It's quite a tough play. That's the other thing that came out in rehearsal. A lot of people think it's rather, faintly elegiac, faintly Chekhovian melancholy. And, there are elements of that. I mean, there's a certain period in the play, near the end, there's a passage towards the end, when you do get the sense of a world vanishing and a different kind of society taking over. But it's just touched in. It's not a great big author's message or anything. But something else I think we all spotted the more we worked on it, that the people in it are quite tough-minded, I suppose is the right word. And just the other day I was reading something by an American writer, an American dramatist, who knew Bagnold quite well, a dramatist called S.N. Berman, forgotten now, sadly, but he wrote a lot of very successful plays in America. He didn't have much luck in this country in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And he adapted a very early novel by Enid Bagnold called Serena Blandish, which is a bit like Zuleika Dobson. It's about a very posh, very beautiful girl trying to land a husband. The subtitle is The Difficulty of Getting Married. Anyway, he loved the book, so he adapted it, and it was quite successful on Broadway and quite successful in London. And Vivien Leigh played the Serena Blandish. Anyway, he said something very interesting about Bagnold. He said, the first thing I was drawn to was her extraordinary, glittering language. But the second thing, he said, which balanced the language, must get this right, was her tough-minded, hard awareness of the diamond-sharp realities of life. And I thought that was rather a shrewd thing to say, despite her life of privilege, because she grew up in a relatively wealthy household, but she did have to find her own way. She had to work. She wasn't a spoiled debutante or anything, but she was drawn into rather glittering circles, shall we say. But, during the war, she was perfectly prepared to keep her family self-sufficient by keeping a cow and mucking out. And
did she not drive ambulances?
She drove the First World War. She drove an ambulance. In the Second World War, she and her great friend Diana Cooper were virtually self-sufficient with dairy produce. They had pigs, there's a famous photograph of her literally mucking out the byre, wearing a rubber apron and wellies. So, she was perfectly prepared to get her hands dirty.
And I must say now, I'm very interested in her as well as the work. Now, a quick last question from me before we take a couple from the floor. You, as well as being a wonderful director and all the things you've done in theatre, also a writer and a biographer.
Biographer, yes.
I think that's a writer,
Well, yes, I know, but I don't write fiction. I only do biographies.
No, you do the truth. I make stuff up. That's a different thing. But they're very, very different things. You as the director, you have this cast of people, you have all the creative team, you're putting something out publicly, you living a public life while you're being that creator.
Yes.
And then you go back to your desk and you're in archives and researching. What is it that draws you back to writing? Is it to escape the public stuff, or do you just think they work together?
I don't think it's that. It's just, I've been doing this for an awfully long time. Not the writing so much, but the theatre. And I've been very, very, it sounds awfully sentimental, but it's true. I've been very lucky with mentors, I suppose. People who were extraordinarily helpful and kind to me when I was starting out. And I think all I like to do when I do my biographies, I like to write about people I knew, or...
Hence Vivien Leigh.
No, I didn't know Vivien Leigh.
Right.
No, I didn't know her. I saw her act several times, and I worked with a lot of people who did know her, who have told me a great deal about her. But Michael Redgrave I worked with, and he was very, very influential on me, just about his whole approach to the world of the theatre. And a producer called Michael Codron, who gave me a play in the West End when I was I didn't know anything. I was as green as I was cabbage looking. And I can't remember how old I was, but I was only in my early 20s. But he must have spotted something. And he gave me a show, which really got me started properly. So in a way, I suppose what I'm trying to do, if it doesn't sound too poncy, is to put something back and try and recall people who would probably otherwise be forgotten. I know Vivien Leigh won't be forgotten because of Gone with the Wind and Streetcar Named Desire on film, but because of her marriage to Olivier, she was very overshadowed as a theatre performer. And I was lucky enough to see her 3 times in the theatre at a very impressionable age, really impressionable age, when you are affected by what you see and what you read and things like that. And there was something about her, although I don't do the kind of work she did, but there was something about her that just interested me. And the more I read about her, the more interested I became. And then when I realised that her archive had become available at the V&A and had been catalogued and was available for me to consult, I thought, well, if this archive is good, I think I would write a book. And it was good. It was very rich. So a lot of the book comes from the archive. But no, it's not, I don't think it's to escape anything. No, I just enjoy it. And it is very different. But that's part of the delight of doing it. And then it's lovely to come back to the theatre when you're,
go backwards and forwards.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and one thing that's been lovely about this play is that most unusually, in a play of 9 characters, 7 of them are women. Virtually, apart from me and Simon Higlett, the entire production team is women. And that is so unusual. You don't often get that. I've done a few all-male plays, and they're dead boring. But no, that's one of the reasons it's been so enjoyable.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, we have time for a couple of questions. I know very few people have seen, but I can see your lady in the front row. Thank you very much.
I'm wording this very carefully. There's a question that Mrs. St. Maume asks the governess towards the end of the play, which gets a response but not an answer. It's left very ambiguous, and I think that's one of the masterstrokes of this play. I did wonder if in rehearsals, if you'd made up your minds either way on that one.
Well, that's interesting. The question is the question, the governess, and the question is asked and there is no answer quite near the end of the play.
Right at the end of the play. No.
Did you decide?
I know what I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. To answer your question, I do not know what Amanda Root thinks. We left that quite deliberately open. The actor has to know, the director has to have at least an idea, but we don't have to agree.
Interesting. And so will it change, do you think? Do you think the intonation or the look will change?
Well, no, I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. I think Amanda knows exactly what she did or didn't do. I can't say any more, otherwise it will spoil it all. No, you can't say any more.
And indeed, in the post-show, that is the sort of question we could indeed ask her. Is there another question now?
It actually isn't a question. I just felt that your description of the whole scenario behind this play and the characters, there's a germ of a play in that. I thought it was quite extraordinary.
Oh, gosh, yes. Yeah. You mean, yes, I don't know who would play Gladys Cooper, though.
No. Oh, no, that's tempting to even begin to think.
That would be very difficult.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can I ask a question? Because we're nearly out of time. With a play that is actually so well constructed, and now you've explained how it is, and the cleverness of there being ambiguity, even though you come out feeling satisfied at the end of it and all the rest of it, when you move a play like that from the rehearsal room onto the stage, and you are suddenly faced with the challenge of this wonderful space as well as the
Yes,
opportunity.
it has lots of challenges, yeah.
How much does it kind of root itself down once you're in here, as opposed to the rehearsal room? How much change is there?
Well, it always breathes a different air for a bit when you come in from the rehearsal room. Everything seems different somehow. Even if you're coming into a proscenium stage, when the floor is exactly the dimensions you've worked in. Oddly enough, on this one, I think it's something to do with the fact that the set, well, apart from anything else, it's very welcoming.
Yes.
It's a set that feels good under the actors' feet. You know, actors are very, quite rightly, keen to make sure that the stage supports them well. you know, a lot of actors can't work unless they've got the right shoes. I can sort of understand that. Like Beryl Reid couldn't find a character until she'd found the shoes.
Really?
Oh, no. Yeah. No. And she was in despair sometimes until she found the pair of shoes that fitted the character. And also, it was so like the world that is described in the play. I think they felt it, quite crudely, I think they sort of felt at home.
Yes.
Whereas some sets you walk onto and you've seen the model, of course, and you've seen pictures that the designer may have drawn of it and everything. But sometimes you move from the rehearsal room onto the stage and it feels very alien. I mean, that happens quite often, in fact. But not here. It really didn't. And also, we had spent a lot of time on the staging, partly bearing in mind the fact that, you know, there are people in the side seats and they can't be neglected. So the dynamic of how it's staged, surprisingly, didn't change too much. Often you have to completely change the staging when a scene doesn't quite work. There's been a little bit of that, inevitably. And there was one scene in particular that I knew I hadn't got right in the rehearsal room, and I thought, well, it'll sort itself out on stage. And it did, but I still had to re-rehearse it to get it absolutely right. But no, this time round, it wasn't too tricky. Yeah. It really wasn't.
Well, I mean, it is wonderful to have you back.
No, it's a pleasure. I hope I'm back again.
I'm sure you will be.
You never know.
You never know.
This might be my swan song.
I doubt that very much.
No,
we
I
wish you
don't know.
all the best of luck for the press night, you know, and all of those sorts of things. But, ladies and gentlemen, for now, could you please thank biographer and director Alan Strachan.